Genesis as we continue with this survey of the Old Testament. And tonight the first thing we're going to talk about, if you get your outlines, is the age of the Patriarchs. And I wanted to begin with, by the time Abraham comes on the scene in history, there have been numerous societies, civilizations that have already come and gone by the time of Abraham. So, and Abraham is from a part of the world that we call remember we studied it last week? It's the shape of a moon.
Crescent.
Right, the Fertile Crescent, the Mesopotamian Valley, and the world that we begin to see in the Bible. Do you know what Mesopotamia means? Meso means middle. Potamia means rivers. So it's the middle of the two rivers, the area between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates River. But where did Abraham, this ancient world we're going to look at first of all from 2000 to 1750 BC, where did Abraham originate? Ur of the Chaldees. And Ur was a world power until about 1950 BC. And then you have numerous other civilizations that end up dominating that part of the world. Assyrians, Babylonians, Mari, Elam, and so that part of the world is very transitional. Over in Egypt, which is the far end of the other end of the Fertile Crescent, you have a time of great prosperity. Very stable. They have 6 kings during this time, 6 pharaohs that on average rule 30 years each. They do a lot of things in Egypt. They develop their canal system to irrigate their land. They have a lot of trade with other countries. Medicine flourishes, mathematics, etc., etc. It's really the golden age of Egypt. And then in Palestine, what's going on in Palestine is really nothing. You have semi-nomadic tribes or clans that are moving back and forth. You begin to see an influx of people, but not a lot of people yet. And Abraham and his people will be some of the first peoples that enter into that area. And there's not a lot of change there, but soon there will be some change. So when you move to the next time frame, 1750 to 1550 in Mesopotamia, you have Assyria and the Babylonians. All of these civilizations, they vie for power at different times, and they end up conquering each other. As one becomes very prosperous, what happens? It decays from within, almost always. Sound familiar? And then as they decay from within, another power comes along and takes their place. All right? So, the rivers in that area, the Tigris and Euphrates, are very unpredictable. Floods would cause big problems there. The failure of crops when there was no floods, etc. The Assyrians were most powerful during the mid-18th century. And then after the Assyrians came the nation Mari, M-A-R-I, which was only in power for about 50, 60 years. They were the real inventors of the chariot. Then after that came Babylon, all right? And Babylon had a run. Babylon actually ruled and then fell and then ruled again. And it was a great city. The Code of Hammurabi that we talked about last week. And then in then Egypt, during this time, Egypt began to lose control of what was going on. And there were some outsiders that came in. Have you ever heard of the Hyksos? Hyksos. That's what the word means, is foreigners. They were actually able to come in and usurp the pharaohs, and they were able to take over control of the country. And so then after, does everybody have outline? Does anybody need one? Is there any more outline?
Yeah.
Mama's got one.
Oh,
Ron needs one.
okay.
After a series then of liberation attempts, the Egyptians were actually able to take their land back, okay? And then, so what's going on in Palestine during this time? What's going on in Palestine? There isn't a lot. Foreign people coming through, traveling through, but there were some kings. Remember in Abram's time there were the 4 kings? But they were really, when you speak of kings in Palestine at that time, they were kings over cities. They weren't that remarkable in what they were doing. Pardon me?
What was going on in Egypt?
In Egypt in this time, Egypt was going downhill. They were being dominated by foreigners. Although, as this time frame ends, they actually are able to retake their country. Because by the time Abraham comes into the picture, by the time the Egyptian people or the Jewish people get into Egypt, Egypt is again a significant power in the world, okay? So, like I said, not too much still going on in Palestine. So these are significant dates. From the year 2000 to 1700 BC is considered to be the age of the patriarchs, okay? And that is in the book of Genesis, Genesis 12 through 50. All right? As Abram comes on the scene, his sons, etc., 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 as his lineage begins to grow. All right? Then you have the period of what is called the national formation, which is from 1700 to 1000 BC. And that's in the books Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, and Judges. All right? And included in that is the people, the nation Israel ends up in Israel from, do you know how many years they were in captivity? 400 years. Okay? 400 years, from approximately 1700 BC to 1300 BC. Then around 1280, they believe, now these dates are, around 1280, there's the Exodus. And then they wander around how long? And then what do? They conquer Canaan, okay? Which is what we call Palestine. You could call it Canaanstein, and you would be more accurate. Palestine is really, that name is made up. And so that happens by around 1200. They have conquered all they will conquer of Palestine. At that same time, in other parts of the world, the Greek city-states are dominant. And really the Greeks are dominant all over the world from about 1200 to 1000 BC. So then what's going on at the turn of the century in Palestine is that the Jewish people have a monarchy, right? They have kings, right? Remember the book of Samuel, the books of Kings, and the books of Chronicles. Kings and Chronicles are interwoven. You get a very complete history if you compare the two. You can go from date to date to date to date, okay? And until approximately 922, there was one nation, Israel. But then what happened in 922? There's a rebellion, we end up with a divided kingdom. And the northern kingdom is the nation of Israel, and the southern kingdom is the nation Judah. So from about 922 to 722, the nation Israel, there is a nation Israel, but during a lot of her history, she is paying to be a nation. What a lot of strong nations did during that time frame is they subjected other nations to paying them to keep peace. So Israel, under several different oppressors, had to pay money to not get conquered. And it was a good deal for the oppressing nation because they didn't have to go to war, they didn't have to send soldiers, they didn't have to lose people, so they could take care of their own territory. Okay, so until 722, and then they're taken away, and for about another 150 years, the nation Judah, either you can go with the date 587 or 589 BC. That's when they are conquered. Okay, and everybody goes to where they go. Everybody is taken to Babylon. Everybody's taken to Babylon. Okay, and then they're in Babylon how long? 70 years. And then after 70 years, you have the period called the Restoration and the Reconstruction. From 538 through 63 BC. That's when you have Ezra and Nehemiah, and then what happens? You have 400 years of silence. So all you can rely upon for those 400 years, you have to read history books from that time frame to see what goes on there. So they were under the Persian influence for about 150, 200 years. Then they were under the Greek influence. Then they finally gained independence about 167, and that's only for about 100 years. And by then they start another cycle of being dominated. So, as I said, it's really hard to have precise dates. You can read different books, different commentaries. The thing about commentarians, everybody wants to have unique ideas, so somebody will buy their book. So everybody likes to have different years. But the thing about all of this time, as it's reflected in the book of Genesis, it's perfect. And by that I mean that everything that's portrayed in the book of Genesis fits perfectly of what we know about the history of that time. Okay? The customs, the names, the travel patterns, everything. And they have found outside books, outside records, outside scrolls which reflect the validity of the Bible. Okay? Things like names. The names that of the age of the patriarchs fit perfectly into the places that are reflected in the patriarch time. From Mesopotamia through Palestine, names like Jacob, Abraham, Benjamin, Ishmael, Levi, all these names are mentioned in different secular sources, so we know they're legitimate names, okay? Customs. Did somebody say something? I'm hearing things. Open your Bibles to Genesis. I want you to look at some customs that are very, very very legitimate in the way they're portrayed. Look at Genesis 16, 1 through 4. Somebody read that for us.
Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband, Abraham, to be his wife. After Abraham had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, so he went to Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes.
Okay. So what is Abraham, what is Abraham living his life by at that particular moment? What is his moral code consist of? What does he have to live his life by? Customs. A lot of the custom of his ancestors. It was common practice at that time in that part of the world that if a woman did not conceive for 10 years, then the woman would allow her head maid servant to become her husband's wife. Okay, for the opportunity to have a male heir. So what you read in the Bible perfectly fits the custom of the time. Okay, because there isn't no 10 Commandments, there isn't no Leviticus yet. This is old times. Go back to chapter 15, 1 through 4. Somebody read that for us.
After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceeding great reward." But Abram said, "Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" Then Abram said, "Look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir."
So why did Abraham? Why did he adopt Eliezer?
So to be his heir.
To be his heir. But God said you don't need to adopt him. But that's why he did it. And according to the codes of that time, that was a very legitimate thing for him to do. Look at 21, verse 10. Somebody read that verse. 21:10.
Therefore she said to Abraham, "Drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac."
Okay, now when you read that, that is the exact opposite of the code. So you have to say, "What up?" Right, Paul?
Amen.
Amen. What up with that? Read verse 12. All right.
But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. For through Isaac your descendants shall be named."
So God says, forget the code. And then he begins the practice of what has happened throughout history. God tells Abraham, listen to your wife.
Can I quote that, put that Bible verse
Yes,
on my
you
mirror?
You can use that whenever you need it. Okay?
Can I do the same thing?
Well,
What
what up? All right, guys.
He opened the door.
Okay. So then, I tell you those things just so you'll see that the Bible is very legitimate in the way it treats all these circumstances that happen in the Bible, so that you understand the validity. It affirms the validity of the Word. The kind of life that they lived at that time, these people are semi-nomadic. They're nomads, and they're living off the land, and they move what kind of animals do they have? Sheep. And they move them according to the seasons. They move them back and forth in the coastal plain, feeding their animals according to the season. And even their movements, as we look at the Word and we see where they're at different times of the year, even their movements reflect the validity of what it says in the book of Genesis. So what of these people? I have in your outline the ancestors of the Hebrews. So these people that are the Hebrews, that become the Hebrews, have ancestry, and their ancestry begins again in Ur of the Chaldees, which is way over in the eastern end of the Fertile Crescent. Okay, and then where do they go from there? What's Abram's dad's name? Do you know? Terah. T-E-R-A-H. Terah takes a couple of his family members, and what does he do? He moves from Ur, and where does he go? Because he doesn't go from Ur all the way to Palestine. He goes to Haran, H-A-R-A-N, okay? Which is about, now there is another city called Ur by Haran, but I think the city they left, the Ur of the south, had about 250,000 people in it. It was a big city. And I think they went to Haran, which was about 600 miles northwest. And then from there, they would have probably went to Damascus, another major population center, and then come down into what we call Palestine today. When they left Ur, the time that they left Ur was a very successful, prominent society, known for its medicine, math, irrigation, etc., etc. So, when they left that area, they brought with them their codes. Remember I talked about the code of Hammurabi, the first real legal code in the world. They brought that with them, and of all the codes in the ancient world, the code of Hammurabi is the closest to the Ten Commandments. All right. So the religion that the patriarchs then began to practice as they took up residence in Palestine. You know, they worshiped how many gods? One. But how many names did their God have? A lot. So singers, you're going to sing that song?
El Shaddai.
What does El, now El means what? E-L means God. Whenever you see El, it means God. El Shaddai,
You did not this.
what is it? What is it? What does El Shaddai mean? It means, the word Shad in Hebrew actually means breast. El Shaddai means all sufficient. The God that is all sufficient. The one that provides, okay? As a mother does for her child. El Elyon means God Most High. Somebody look at Genesis 16:13. Read that one verse for me. No, that's not the one I want you to read. Look for, let me go through some more names, then we'll get to 16:13. Just stay there. El Olam is, Olam means everlasting. Okay? Everlasting God. God that's everlasting. El Roi means, this is 16:13. Somebody read 16:13. I'll tell you what it means. El Roi. Genesis 16:13.
Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees. For she said, have I also here seen him who sees me?
Who's that? Who's talking?
Hagar.
Hagar. El Roi means the God who sees me. And what does it call him? What does how does it open? what is it called?
Then she called the name of the Lord. You
The
are
name
the
of the
God
Lord?
who sees.
Okay, the name of the Lord,
Yeah. Who spoke to her.
okay. Anybody have a different version? What version is that?
It's the New King James.
Is it the New King James?
Yeah.
I want to look at that. Genesis.
Mine says the name of the Lord, thou art a God who sees.
I want you to go probably about 5 verses before that. I don't know what the number. Look at 11. Look at 16:9. The angel of the Lord said to her, okay? Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child. You shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be this is a description of Ishmael's descendants. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand shall be against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. And then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, El Roi. That's what that translation is. So who is the angel of the Lord? God. The angel of the Lord. This is what we call do you know what we call this in theology? This is theophany. It's an appearance of the Lord. It's like an epiphany. You know, epiphany. What other, where can you think of other theophanies? It's hard for me to say. In the Bible?
Yeah, when Abraham was going to offer Isaac on Mount Moriah, when the angel of the Lord told him not to harm his son.
Okay. Others?
When the three angels appeared, to Abraham.
The Transfiguration?
No, but when
Was one of them the Lord?
when the three angels came and he entertained them and washed their feet and gave them food and.
Was one of them
Right
God?
before Sodom and Gomorrah.
Was one of those God? One has to be God. Was one of those God? How about the tabernacle? Is that a theophany? You think? A theophany? Theo, God. Phany, Phany. Theo, Phany. It means a God vision, God manifestation. How about Moses? How about the burning bush? Moses. What else? Anybody? You can do a whole study on theophanies. So those names now. So think of those names: all sufficient, everlasting God, God who sees me, Most High God. Those are all names that reflect a godly personality to his people. A God who cares, a God who makes provision, etc., etc., etc. Versus and who are the pagans' gods? They are gods that represent usually nature and are very, very mean. They're very vindictive. They almost always require some type of sacrifice, but it's almost always human. Versus this God who tells his people that humanity, his creation, is in fact made in his image and should not be, he wants his people to guard the life of each other. So, these people that became the Jews out of Mesopotamia at one time worshipped pagan gods. So this is quite a difference. You hear in the names that is given to their God in Genesis, in this middle section of Genesis, you hear the change in the way they feel about their God. Okay? So Abraham moved from east to west through the Fertile Crescent, and everywhere where the cities that it speaks of Abraham going in the Palestine are all cities that have between 10 and 20 inches of rain per year. Is that a lot of rain, Ron? If we had 10 inches of rain here every year, what would it look like?
Oh, 10, you say 10?
10 to 20 inches per year.
We have about 10.
Do we have about 10 here? So if we average 15 a year, then would that make a significant difference? A lot more grass, be a lot greener, be like, I don't know, what would it be like? Huh? Sonoida, yeah. So there's some things then when you look at Abraham, there's some personality traits that typify him. One of his problems, Abraham oftentimes had problems when he was under pressure. Okay? One of his early pressures in the book of Genesis is the condition of his wife. Okay? What do we know about Abraham's wife, Sarah? She was beautiful. And there's an Egyptian minister that wrote about Sarah in 1600 BC. I'll tell you what he said. He said, how beautiful the look on her face, and how fine the hair of her head, how pleasing her nose, and all the radiance of her face. Her arms are goodly to look at, and her hands, how perfect. So, I don't know, Sarah, I guess she was an enthralling woman. But we know Abraham suffered weaknesses in the area of, what did Abraham do in regards to his wife? He told everybody she was his sister. Why did he do that? Huh? Afraid of what? Afraid that they'd kill him to get his wife. And the other major instance of his weakness would probably have to do with the taking of his wife's maidservant. He did at times, he made some good decisions. He was more than generous with his family members. He gave Lot the choice of where Lot wanted to go. And Lot, you know what Lot did? He took the best place. And then what happens when Lot gets messed up? He goes back and rescues him. So he makes some good choices. He's a man of honor. Okay? But in the 15th chapter, if you look at 15, 17, you get into the covenant. And in Abraham's day, there were two types of covenants that were made. Covenants between what you would call equals, and then covenants between a superior and an inferior. And that's what happens with God and Abraham, and eventually between God and Israel. Okay? And the covenants typically contain certain information. First of all, they identified who was the greater one. Okay? They typically identify what the greater one has done or will do for the lesser one. They also almost always delineate what the lesser one is supposed to do for the greater one. What's the lesser one in this instance supposed to do? Well, what did God expect from his people? Obedience. That's was his expectation. That was their obligation to him. And then there's other certain things, but usually somewhere in there, there's a series of blessings that will happen to the lesser one if they function properly, and a series of curses that will happen if they don't. So, and these treaties, these covenants were binding as long as these entities existed. In this place, you would consider it to be God and his chosen people. So is God's covenant with his chosen people still active to this day?
Yes.
Yes, it is. That's why they are still so important. Other important things in Genesis at this time, chapters 18 and 19, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The birth of Ishmael we talked about a little while ago. Ishmael versus Isaac, that whole scenario. There's a story I read. I'll tell you the story. It's from a different source. It's about Abraham. Abraham, and this is what it reads. Abraham, it says, finally held the knife over his beloved son. Isaac was doomed. But the angels of heaven shed tears, which fell upon Isaac's eyes, which caused his blindness later in life. This is a secular reading, okay? This is a story about Isaac. But the angel's prayer was heard, and the Lord sent Michael the archangel to tell Abraham not to sacrifice his son. And the dew of life was poured on Isaac to revive him. And then the ram was offered in his place. So that's how that writer explains the blindness of Isaac. That's how he explains that. But he's not a Christian writer. He's not a Jewish writer. He's a secular writer. So, significant funerals. The death of Sarah is significant. Sarah, I think, is the only woman in the Bible that we're told how old she is when she dies. 120 years, I think. 120 or 130. Pardon me?
127.
Was it 127? Isaac's marriage. There's a thing called the Mari tablets, again a secular source, that talk about the king of Assyria negotiating with a king in central Syria, which would be down towards the Palestine area, for the marriage of his son to of the latter's daughter. The two kings negotiating over the marriage. Chapter 25 talks about Abraham's marriage, death, etc., his later marriage and his death. And then you come to Jacob as you continue through these patriarchs. What is Jacob most significant for? He was what kind of person was he? Before that, he was a deceiver. He was a swindler. What did he do? What was his biggest swindle? Stole his brother's birthright. He ended up, because of his lifestyle, he ended up in some difficult situations, in some difficult positions. In verse 28, he has to run. He has different encounters with God. He vows things to God, and then he forgets things that he's vowed. He just kind of ignores them. 29 through 31 are his difficult times. There's a relationship, remember, between Jacob and a man that seems to have almost adopted him. Do you remember that? Laban? Okay. And it was normal for if a man took an adopted son like that, it was normal for him to give that son his daughter's hand in marriage. That's normal for this time in history. Again, another thing that shows how God's word reflects the time that these people lived in. And then and then from him flow the 12 tribes, and then we get to Joseph. Joseph is an interesting part of the book of Genesis, because the book of, the section about Joseph is a narrative. It's like, see, the Genesis is very historical up to this point, but this is like a storyteller telling you a story. That's some people think Moses didn't write the part about Joseph. I think he wrote it all. But if you read about Joseph, are there any miracles? Beyond God's straight intervention, you don't have as much miraculous things going on. You have what I would call divine revelation. God reveals things to him. But the real hero of the story, Joseph, is who? God. God's the real hero. Joseph is the secondary hero. But the theme of the Genesis writings about Joseph is how God guided him. Even during his early years in Egypt, when he really wasn't anything of importance, God's hand was still on him. So he gets in trouble when he gets to Egypt, chapters 37 and 39. What's her name? Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. And then what sells Joseph to the Pharaoh about him being a wise man? What's the significant thing he does in chapter 40 that causes Pharaoh to think this guy's got a good idea of what's going on? He interprets a dream. Look at that dream real quick. See, where's the narrative of the dream?
Is it 41?
41. Had a dream. 7 cows came out of the river. How important is the river to the Pharaoh? Very important. Have you ever seen any of the Egyptian statues of their gods with horns, cow horns? They had a god that was a cow. And so all of these things that are in his dream are very, 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 the name of the cow god is Hathor, Hathor. And all of these things are very significant. And he interprets this dream, and because he interprets this dream and the way he interprets it, it places him in a position of importance in the land of Egypt. And the titles of those guys, when he's back in prison, the chief of the butlers and the chief of the bakers, those are real names, those are titles. Those are real titles in Egypt at that time in their history, those kind of guys. So he's accepted by the ruling class. He becomes, and it was normal at that time in history for slaves to become king's favorites. Because what countries did was, when they conquered another country, what they do with the best people? They took them, they assimilated them, and they took them into their society, and they used their intellect and their ability and their knowledge. So then in 42 through 45, he gets reunited with his brother. Remember the part of it about the famine? That famine is legitimate. It's recognized in other sources other than the Bible. Okay? And then his family comes, and they end up joining him in Egypt. And really at that time, as that famine spread and grew worse and worse, a lot of people ended up in Egypt. And then, Joseph's agricultural policies saved the land. It made Pharaoh much money. And then when you get to the end of Genesis, you look at the deaths of Jacob and Joseph, and there's a series of blessings in 47. And that's about it. Next time I'll begin with we'll talk about the Exodus. The Exodus and then the conquest of Canaan, okay? After the 400 years in exile in Egypt. Any questions? Anybody? Nobody?
In Roger's class, we had a picture of the cow goddess.
Did you have a picture of Hathor?
We did.
And Greg and I will be answering your questions next Sunday night, so, about the separation.
Oh, yeah.
Let's stand. If you can, help us move furniture.